Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience. On behalf of Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada and Rotary Club of Winnipeg Peace Builder Committee, I welcome all of you to this special webinar today. And today is a special day because we have invited Tony McAleer, the author of The Cure for Hate, in joining us in a dialogue about racism, anti-racism, and how to prevent it. As a tradition, before we begin, we do treaty acknowledgement. The Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and the mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, we have invited Mr. Tony McAleer for our today's presentation. And let me briefly introduce him, and then I'll switch to one of the trailers that he prepared in the past. Tony spent 15 years in the white supremacist and neo-Nazi movements, starting as a skinhead and evolving to leadership positions, and was instrumental in ushering in the internet, building one of the first white supremacist websites for resistant records in the mid-90s. Tony's expertise is gleaned from receiving over 1,000 hours of one-on-one group counseling to understand his own process. Tony has spent countless hours coaching and mentoring change in others and is a certified life coach. Tony has been involved in Life After Hate since its inception in 2011 and served as executive director from 2013 to 17, while Life After Hate developed its online support groups and the Exit USA program. In 2017, he became board chair until his departure in December 2019. Tony has worked closely informing law enforcement and government, from attorney generals to senior staffs at the Department of Homeland Security. Tony was recently at the Paris Summit for the Christchurch call with the Prime Minister of New Zealand and supporting government and law enforcement in Victoria, Australia, helping them grapple with the rising problem of violent white supremacist groups. Tony is the author of the book, The Cure for Hate, a former white supremacist journey from violent extremism to radical compassion. Tony is featured in the full-length documentary Healings from Hate, Battle of the Soul of a Nation, which we are going to show briefly now. So, having introduced Tony and his brilliant works, let us quickly watch a very brief clip of Healing from Hate, Battle for the Soul of Nation.
The superior race, we were here first, and this is our country. Look at me, I'm on the edge of the vanguard to save the white race.
Guns, ammo, steel toe, Doc Martens, tattooing. Violence was just prerequisite to enter or exit.
Life After Hate was founded by ex-neo-Nazi white supremacists, and they knew that they wanted to help other guys get out.
I can't tell you how many hundreds of people, while they're in the movement, are too afraid to leave.
What really changed me was receiving compassion from the people that I least deserved it from, when I least deserved it.
You've got to find a way to find an affirmation in every discussion, no matter how bad it feels that it's going. It takes guts to do that. This is why the intervention can't rely on my charisma.
We are like the anti-venom to hate, you know what I mean? Because we had that venom in us, and we know how to spew it, and we know how to also make it an anti-venom.
You should have been so badly broken that there's no way you could come back from this. If you did, so can he.
Right.
Someone in that life who may not be aware that there's a way out, what would you say to them?
Let go all the hate, dude. That hate ruins you.
You humanized him, which allowed him to humanize you. Like that's not rocket science, but yeah, it's evading the majority of the country right now.
It's a lot of change that you're getting thrown at you right now.
Yeah, a lot. You guys have been lifelines.
That's why I think
irreplaceable.
we are operating as human beings in one of two places: fear or love. And we get to choose which one that
So it was so engaging. I was watching it in the morning again. I saw it. I use it in the class actually when I teach the course. So, ladies and gentlemen, also to mention that we are joined today from Winnipeg Police Service officers Andrea Lefort and Bonnie Emerson. Welcome, ma'am, to this session. And also Mr. Gary Senf, the Vice President of the Rotary Club of Winnipeg Peace Builder Committee, is with us. So we have full session today. So, dear audience, without further ado, let me welcome Tony McAleer to the session. Tony, floor is yours, sir. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for making the time to be here today. And I'm coming to you from Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Salish peoples. There's a lot of myths about who joins these types of groups, and I didn't come from an economically deprived family. I didn't come from a broken family. There was no violence in my household. I grew up on the west side of Vancouver. My father was a doctor. I went to private school. I came from really a very privileged upper middle class background. And nobody's born a neo-Nazi. I often joke and say we're all born skinheads, but nobody's born a neo-Nazi, and people choose that path often for a feeling of safety, a feeling of power, a feeling of attention, acceptance, and a sense of purpose. And it's often comes from events that have happened early in their lives that make those choices make sense. I was a straight A, B student growing up, and my father loved us very much, and his way of loving us was to be a phenomenal provider. But I didn't see him very often. He was working 80 hours a week, and for me growing up, the thing that I craved the most was his love and attention and approval. But it was not seeing him. I didn't get too much of that. I think I was about 10. I was 10 when I walked in on my dad with another woman, and that really rocked my world. And it left me feeling, I felt shame, anger. I felt betrayed by the authority figures in my life. And I went from listening to Queen and Elton John to the Clash and the Sex Pistols, and by the next year in grade 6, I was 11. I was getting C's and D's, and the school tried everything. It was an all boys Catholic school, everything to give me carrots in order to do better. None of them worked. I was too sort of angry at that moment. So they got together with my parents and decided that if I didn't get an A or a B on major tests and assignments, I was hit on the rear end with a meter stick. And I remember those times being marched down to the office and sitting outside that office, and I'm sure some of your listeners are familiar with knowing something really bad's about to happen and there's nothing you can do about it. And having to go into that office and put my hands on the edge of his desk, and he said to me, this is going to hurt me more than it's going to hurt you. And I'm not sure who that lie was supposed to comfort, but it wasn't me. To this day, I don't think I've ever felt more weak and powerless than I did in that office over and over and over again. And that, I think, really set the stage for me choosing a friend's music lifestyle, which made me feel the exact opposite of that. And I just want to be very clear here. Everything I did, I chose to do. and I have to take responsibility and be accountable for those choices. I don't blame anything that I did on my childhood. I take full responsibility for the choices I made, but I share it with you so you understand the lens through which I made those choices. And I'm not sure if you've ever gone to the grocery store when you're really hungry and you sort of make different food choices, right? You know, you're shopping more from the center aisles than you are from the healthy stuff around the outside. And as a young man, I went into the world emotionally hungry, and I made horrific choices that harmed a great deal of people and harmed myself in the process. And that sort of process I talk about it is toxic shame, and toxic shame is the feeling of being less than, the feeling of being not good enough, not worthy enough, not smart enough, not pretty enough, not athletic enough, not tough enough, you know. And it's not a conscious thought, but it exists in our subconscious, in our sort of self-identity belief system, that what we believe about ourselves at a very core. And we live our lives in reaction to that. And maybe, you know, an example is, have you ever been in a relationship where the other person made you feel small? That's kind of what toxic shame is. And sometimes as an adult that happens, and it reminds us of when it happened as a child. And, you know, we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to do two things. One, hide the shame from the world. And two, toxic shame is the dirty secret we hide from ourselves. And so we numb ourselves. We, you know, when we internalize and process the shame, all kinds of self-harm are different ways in which we do that. And suicide would be the ultimate expression of internalized shame. There's a great book on the topic called Healing the Shame That Binds You by Dr. John Bradshaw. And he was sort of an addiction specialist. And he said, shame is the root of all addiction. Or we externalize the shame. You know, one way of overcoming that feeling of less than is we can become an overachiever and prove to the world that we're greater than, or we can have to win every business negotiation and deal we enter into and prove ourselves stronger than the other person. That might actually sound like someone familiar that was recently a lot in the news. Or what I did is I chose an ideology that told me I was greater than. And, you know, one way to overcome that feeling of being small is to make people around you even smaller and make yourself larger, bigger in the process. So violence, verbal violence, emotional violence, the reason people join gangs, extremist groups, all of that stuff has at its root toxic shame. And there's a great book by, I can't remember the name of the author, but it's Violence, Study of a National, Reflections on a National Epidemic. And he was a forensic psychiatrist in the penitentiary system in California. And he said, all violence is an attempt to convert shame into self-esteem, and that he never saw an act of violence that wasn't rooted in shame and humiliation. And so at the root of it, I think this is at the core of the problem. And when I first met skinheads, you know, I was kind of into the punk scene because it was angry and that was vibing with me. But when I first met skinheads, I was sort of in awe of them because, and my parents could never understand why this middle-class private school kid was starting to hang out with you know, these skinhead ruffians. They go, I don't understand. Like, what's the attraction? You're smarter. You have all these opportunities. You got a world of whatever you want to do, you can do. Why are you hanging out with these guys? And it's simple. They had the one thing that I didn't, and that was toughness. And when I was with them for the first time in my life, people were afraid of me. Not because of me, because of the people I hung out with. I wasn't a particularly tough guy. I'd been in about half a dozen fights in elementary school. And I became quite addicted to that feeling, that sense of power. And the more radical we became, the more fear and notoriety we got, the more of that hit of, you know, getting the attention. I got power when I'd felt powerless. I got attention when I felt invisible. And I got acceptance and brotherhood when I felt unlovable, and a sense of purpose and meaning. And it had this great noble fantasy that we're going to save the white race from a mythical extinction, and went out into the world, you know, like Viking warriors to, you know, save the race. Kind of, it's really, when I look back at it now, it's nonsense. But in the moment, it checked off all these boxes that I was quite lacking in. And I just want to be very clear here. What I'm talking about is not systems of white supremacy. I'm not talking about unconscious bias. And I'm not talking about casual racism. And I'm not talking about sort of ignorant racism. I'm talking about the racism which in its end form leads to murder. I think this ideology, if left unchecked, always ends up in murder. And I'm talking about an ideology that is inherently and explicitly and implicitly violent. And by that, I mean, if you're talking about the deportation of people from the country, that's violence. If you're talking about exterminating people, that's violence. So I'm talking about a very specific piece to this, and it's the type of organizations like the base that was recruiting in Winnipeg, and Adam Waffen, and and everything from the Klan to the English Defense League to all these different groups. At their core is violence. And if these ideologies and violence gets left unchecked, I believe it inevitably, and history has shown us this, it inevitably ends up in murder. So I want to be sort of very clear about that. So I started off as a skinhead and fighting in the streets and sort of really quite crass forms of racism, and the music kind of really shifted for a while there in the late 80s, 90s, and harnessed the energy of this very violent youth movement. And in doing so, we also attracted the attention of the old guard, the older leaders of different groups, from Aryan nations to the Heritage Front to White Aryan Resistance and different things. And that opened up a whole new world of racism for me. And I quickly got rid of the bomber jacket and the Doc Martens. And, it's funny. I was on the Montel Williams show, national talk show in the United States in 1989, and I was dressed like a skinhead. And I did the show again in 1991, and I was wearing a suit and tie in an effort to mainstream and to seem more reasonable. And in doing so, I started a telephone hotline that was the subject of 2 Canadian human rights complaints, and went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and became quite prolific in my racism and very importantly, Holocaust denial. And in the the propaganda side of things, and it went from street violence to using my brain and my tongue as a weapon, and I think that sometimes can be more insidious, particularly in the anti-Semitism that I was involved with. And it was quite consciously an effort to undermine their sense of safety in the community. Particularly, we believed that there was this hive mind of evil Jews that was running the world and trying to get rid of white people. And so they were the number one concern, and we were quite conscious at instilling a sense of psychological terror, for which I'm quite deeply ashamed to have done. When I left, it was it wasn't an individual moment. It wasn't like a road to Damascus moment. It was a process, but there was a catalyst that started it. And up until this point, I was completely in my ego and self-absorbed in my narcissism. And I found myself standing at 23 in a delivery room, holding this little baby girl, and she hasn't opened her eyes yet, and she's giving this like little scrunchy face, and she opened her eyes for the first time, and my picture was the my face was the first picture her brain would take, and I connected to another human being for the first time since I could remember when, because I was completely cut off from my heart. And as a young person, we become disconnected. We cut ourselves off because it's not safe to be sensitive and open. And you know, as if I think of who I was, and I would ask your audience to do the same, who I was at the age of 3 or 4, who was little Tony? And I was this bright, curious, mischievous, stubborn, a little defiant, open, sensitive little guy. And life happens, and it's not safe to be all those things. And so we put on armor, we wear masks, we project ourselves to be something different in the world in order to feel safe. But with my children, because I had another son 15 months after that, they provided a safe space for me to open up, to allow my heart to feel. You know, young children, they're not capable of shaming, they're not capable of ridicule, they're not capable of rejection until they're about 13, and that's all they want to do for a couple of years. But then it was safe, and I was, you know, I got to parent my children the way I always wanted to be parented, which was very cathartic. And they started the process of rehumanizing me. And I truly believe that the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mirror reflection of how internally disconnected and dehumanized we are. And that's what toxic shame is. It's a self-alienation. It's a self-dehumanization. And you know, what I talk about in my book, if that toxic shame, that that disconnection and self-dehumanization is at the core, then the answer is rehumanizing. And there's many different ways to do that. And that's what my children taught me in retrospect, that first lesson in compassion. And they saw the human being in me that I couldn't see. They saw this magnificent dad that I didn't see when I looked in the mirror. I saw nothing but flaws, and I saw my humanity reflected back at me through the eyes and the faces of my children. And when we're compassionate with someone, that's what we really do, is we hold a mirror up to them and allow them to see their humanity reflected back at them through our actions, through our kindness, through the things we do with them. And I slowly started to, you know, drift out of the movement. I think when they were 2 and 4, I got my teeth knocked out by colleagues in front of them in my living room, and that sort of really put the nail in the coffin. And I left, but I never dealt with any of the anger. I never dealt with any of the wounds in my childhood that made these choices seem like the right thing. And so I was still a jerk. I was still mean to people. I was still would put people down, and you know, there was still expressing toxic shame. It was pouring out of me still, anyways. But more sort of in the self-harm way, and I was drinking way more, and you know, trying to deal with things. It wasn't until I came across. I started a new career in 2004 as a financial advisor. I still am today, and I met someone who introduced me to this guy who did personal development programs and, you know, workshops, and be the best version of you and get out of your own way and overcome your ego and all of that type of stuff. And the more I did these courses, and the more I sort of got, you know, more and more connected to me. I noticed relationships, career, everything was sort of, the relationship with my children was improving. And so I sort of did all of this guy's courses. And by 8 months later, the man who introduced me to this guy for my birthday gave me an envelope, and I excitedly grab the envelope, open it up, and pull it out, and it's a gift certificate for a one-on-one counseling or therapy session with this guy. And I'm like, great, who doesn't want counseling for their birthday, right? Best birthday present ever. And so I go to the session, and I'm telling him about my mom and my dad and why I'm angry and blaming the world. And at that point, everything was someone else's problem, and I was taking no responsibility for anything. And I'm sitting there and I go, do I tell him the rest? Do I tell him about being a neo-Nazi? Do I tell him about the white supremacy and the Holocaust denial and the violence and everything? And I was terrified to do so, because this was a guy that I liked, and he's from Manchester, 10 years older, and I'm from Liverpool, and we bonded over weird 80s pop songs and Monty Python and quirky things that only English people get. And I was terrified of losing the relationship, because in my experience, whenever people had found out about my past, it meant the end of the relationship. And quite often it meant the end of an entire social circle. So I'm staring at the floor, hoping it's going to give me some wisdom. And I'm looking at the ceiling, and do I tell him? Do I tell him? And he says, mate, come on, it's safe here. Just whatever you got to say, just say it, whatever it is. And I'm staring at the floor, and I'm staring at the ceiling, and humming and hawing. And he goes, look, just let it out. You look like you're trying to swallow 3 golf balls. And so I let it all out, and I give him the Reader's Digest of everything that I was involved with. And the more I tell him, the more he starts smiling. And the more he starts smiling, the more annoyed I'm getting. Like, well, I am bearing my soul in my first therapy session, and this guy's laughing at me. I go, what's so funny? And he leans in with a big grin on his face and goes, I'm Jewish, right? Of course. Here's this man who loves me, wants to help me, wants to heal me and my family. And here I am sitting back into the couch, cheeks flushed and burning with shame, knowing that I'd once advocated for the annihilation of him and his people. And he said, that's what you did. That's not who you are. I see, little Tony. I see you. And I started bawling and crying. And if that man could learn to love me, there was no reason why I couldn't learn to love myself. And that began the journey of healing and dealing with the wounds and the hurts that made all of those choices seem like the right thing, that the temporary solution to those problems. And spent over the next 7 years, probably 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group counseling with them, and got to understand the hows and whys that I made those choices and what I got out of those choices, and really transformed my life. And so that was 2005. I started seeing him. 2010, 2011, I got together with other people, who had left the movement like I did. And at the time that I left, there was no programs, there was no assistance. It was just, you left, and it was incredibly lonely. So I'll talk about the time that I left to the time that I got healing as the disengagement phase. From the time I got the healing, that would be I hate this word, but academics use it all the time, de-radicalization. And I really got to, in the disengagement phase, there's a part in there called the void. And in that void, as we leave a social circle behind, as we leave that all behind, we don't necessarily have a new one to join, and as we reestablish a new sense of who we are, our sense of identity, we begin to attract people to that new identity. But we have to go through this period called the void. And in that, you have no friends or social circle. And it's incredibly lonely to make that journey. And it's often, that is the time when people are most apt to return to the dysfunction of the movement. And these white supremacy groups, because at least, as bad as it was, at least they had friends. They weren't alone. And so what we attempted to do was to make that journey one that was made in community. And really that was at the core of what Life After Hate did. And we've expanded it to include professional counseling services, and brought in the social work code of ethics, and really worked to professionalize the organization and the help that it does, and really to provide proof of concept. One thing that's clear is that an organization the size of Life After Hate can't solve this problem on its own. It's not, I don't even think you could have a single organization scale to meet the need. But what it does provide is proof of concept. And I know every community has social workers and has counselors and has the resources and people with the skill set to be able to help people leave these movements behind and become productive, compassionate human beings, to rejoin humanity. So a lot of what I've been doing is sharing the knowledge that we sort of gleaned in building Life After Hate and taking it to communities. And often you'll have professionals that have the skill set to work with it, but they're terrified if someone comes into their office with a swastika tattoo. They can handle all different kinds of dysfunction, but that one they don't understand it, right? So part of the challenge is demystifying it so that we can bring the resources to bear in order to help people out. And so that in a nutshell is my journey. And from the time we started to Charlottesville, we helped 100 people, and that was mostly individuals seeking to leave and seeking help. Since Charlottesville, Life After Hate has helped 500 plus people, and half of those are families or friends of loved ones who are caught up in these groups. But it's taking a slightly different approach. Intuitively, what we want to do is we want to go in and change the ideas in their heads. But really, again, to go back, if self-dehumanization is at the core of the problem, the answer is rehumanization, and that's not an intellectual process. And so the challenge is identity and ideology become intertwined. So it's challenging enough to get people to admit that what they think is wrong. When ideology and intertwined in it, because white supremacy wasn't just what I believed, it was who I was. It was the friends I had, the videos I watched, the music I listened to, the clothes I wore. To try and get someone to admit that who they are is wrong is an exponentially more difficult task. So we have to deal with the ideology at some point, but we have to work really on rehumanizing them. Because again, the level to which we dehumanize other human beings is a mirror reflection of our own disconnection, dehumanization. If we can fix that disconnection and dehumanization, we fix the external dehumanization. And I think I'll stop there and take.
Thank you, Tony. It was fascinating. I was really, and I hope the rest of the panelists today they were equally tuning in whatever you said. So ladies and gentlemen, we'll now start the facilitated Q&A session. And I'd like to welcome first our guests from Winnipeg Police Service, Bonnie and Andrea. Whoever you want to start the discussion with, Tony, please go ahead. Thank you.
I'm just going to grab my door. It keeps creaking.
Okay, well, I'll just introduce ourselves. I'm Bonnie Emerson, and this is Andrea Lefort. So just so you know which is who under our names. Hello, Tony. Thank you very much. You know what? I was just wondering how you find contacts. Do you find that you get concerned or connected with questions more North American based or US based? I mean, you had mentioned Winnipeg, but I'm wondering how far.
So Life After Hate primarily is in the United States. And again, I left Life After Hate at the end of 2019. Any Canadians that they get are referred to. I think the Canadian government has done, public safety has done a pretty good job so far of setting up hubs, with multidisciplinary teams to handle this type of thing. So I think the Organization for the Prevention of Violence in Alberta is, I know, one of the organization that Life After Hate sends referrals to. Most of the people that reach out to us come through the website, but we do get referrals from law enforcement, from sometimes, courts sometimes will involve us, and parents and that type of thing. So we get professional referrals, but most of it comes through the website.
Tony, I'll say with my background schooling, I tend to always look a little bit more at some of the risks of violence that we have from the incel movement, and they're being categorized as far right-wing extremists, and some people say they aren't. But no matter as to what category that we are putting them in, we definitely have an extremist group that has some very violent ideologies, especially some of the language that we're seeing on a lot of these chat forums, and some of the violent acts that we've seen in the support for those acts. Have you guys had any interaction from the incel group?
We've had, I think it's a handful of cases that I'm aware of. When we get into these extremist groups, and I'll say that different from ISIS and Al Qaeda type inspired groups, that there's some unique stuff about that. A lot of it is a mishmash of overlapping ideas and ideologies. So, for example, Proud Boys, is that a white supremacist group? Well, the leader's Afro-Cuban, but are the white supremacists in the group? Absolutely. They're almost like traditionalist extremists. And there's white supremacy, there's the sovereign citizen, the sort of anti-government movements, and they overflow and overlap. There's no one ideology, even in the white supremacist movement. The Klan was always arguing with the Nazis, and everybody, it's so full of ego. Everybody's got their own idea of what the problem and the solution is. But absolutely, what ties them all together, what unifies them all, is their advocacy of violence and the misogyny. That's I would say there's probably left-leaning people in incels as well, and there's people of color in incels, and there's white supremacists in incels. It's all a nebulous blob of these different ideologies, but what they all have in common is their proclivity for violence, if not physical violence, certainly advocating physical violence, and fantasizing about rape and all of that kind of thing, whether they actually go to do it. But that toxic environment in which the challenges in these environments is even if they're just talking about it, they create that toxic environment where somebody stews in that for a while. Somebody will do it in the real world and in the violence. So it is a concern, although we don't see that much of it. And I don't know if there is an organization set up specifically for incels, but we have dealt with them in the past.
Thank you, Tony. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Caden Lee here, and he has joined us shortly after we started. So Caden Lee studies in University of Winnipeg a straight A student, and he leads a group called Realized Radicalization. And the reason I brought him here today, because he's deeply involved in this whole in the intervention part. And I'm going to request him to have a question or two for Tony or for all of us. And what do you see as a young person in this society? The extremism and hate is taking turn, or is evolving in the past. So, Caden, have your question, please.
Yeah, I think one thing I'm definitely noticing 2019 onwards is the rise of these conspiracy narrative groups like QAnon, and how you stated earlier that they all have this sort of interlapping ideology and beliefs. So as a practitioner, are you sort of worried that more people are going to be driven towards these harder sort of neo-Nazi ideologies based on being a member of QAnon or whatever kind of is circulating on the internet?
Well, the interesting thing about QAnon is it recycles many of the old ancient tropes against Jews. For example, the blood libel, and in the 14th and 15th century, the Jews were accused of stealing children and draining their blood and satanic rituals. Well, it's not that different to say that there's a satanic order stealing children that are pedophiles, and there's a lot of ancient anti-Semitic tropes that are reborn in it, and I think we have to respond to these things in the right way. And I think sometimes the media makes things worse by just saying, everyone's a Nazi or everyone's a white supremacist, or throwing these generalized labels. Are these groups growing, or I think yes, they are, but at the same time, what is being labeled as white supremacist is also becoming wider as well. And I think you have to be very careful about how we label people, because if you can push them, those groups are definitely there pulling people into their ranks. But how we respond to them can also push people into their ranks. And we have to be cognizant of the law of unintended consequences, and make sure that these things are so very nuanced that we have to be careful not to go running around with a hammer trying to fix them, because we can actually, the best recruiting thing that I ever had was when they tried to shut my phone line down in the Canadian Human Rights Commission, because then I could say, you see, this information, they don't want you to have it. They're desperate for you not to get this. It's so dangerous. They're so afraid of it. They have to, shut it down. And these things can be used, depending, an overreaction can be used as a fantastic recruiting tool. So it's everything. So you have to think 2 or 3 moves ahead and avoid unintended consequences.
I'll ask one more in terms of disengagement. Is there any possibility to be proactive with disengagement and reach out to people? Or is this something that the individual needs to take a hold of themselves and reach out to you? Is there any benefit of I guess, trying to actively search for these people, find them, and let them know that you have resources available? Or is that just going to alienate them more? No,
I think absolutely. I mean, for Life After Hate, they're swamped with people reaching out to them. Like, the thought of going out and looking for more people they're just trying to deal with the overwhelming of people that they have. But I believe that we can foster disillusionment. See, these organizations, they're highly dysfunctional and toxic. It takes an awful lot of energy to be that angry all the time and to surround yourself with angry people, and it's exhausting to be in them. That's why, you might see someone join a church for a lifetime or a political party for a lifetime. Almost nobody, except maybe someone in a leadership position, stays in these movements a lifetime. This movement churns through people. It sucks people in and spits them out. So I think we can foster disillusionment. I think would be the strategy that I would look at, because if we can take someone whose lifespan in the movement might be 8 or 9 years, and if we can make that 4 or 5, that's 4 or 5 years of harm reduction. You know, if we can shorten their lifespan in the movement and thin the herd somewhat, then we can reduce the harm that they can do. Does that make sense?
Great. Thank you, Tony. Gary, do you want to engage now? Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much, Kauser. So, Tony, one thing that you've done is your storytelling, I think is very helpful, but we're all dealing with fairly unique stories. So the trauma that someone experiences may be a different trauma that leads them down this bad path. So maybe just for a minute or two about the commonality, you know, what is it that we can draw, you know, say Caden or other are doing work in this area. How do you draw people into that comfort zone where they can share this and let the shame kind of roll off them and move in the right direction? I think you used the term in your book, empathy plus action equals compassion.
Yeah. So compassion is you know, there's a bit to unpack there. Compassion is empathy plus action. You can be empathetic to someone and not lift a finger to help them, and that's not compassion. That's empathy. But compassion is taking action to alleviate the suffering of another, and it's often seen as weak and soft. But when it's combined with healthy boundaries and consequences, it becomes incredibly powerful. As a society, for example, we leave the healthy boundaries and consequences, you know, for a lot of stuff to the police department. You know, that's their role, and it's finding the right balance between the healthy boundaries and consequences and compassion. And it's like you can't have justice without mercy, and you can't have mercy without justice. It's finding the right balance between the two. I'm a huge fan of Brené Brown. She's done a lot of great research around shame, and you know, she says when we can provide a safe space for someone to be vulnerable and to express themselves without fear or without shame, the walls come down and people can open up. So it's really critical that we learn to do that. And you know, by listening to someone's grievance, and just because we listen doesn't mean we agree or support that grievance. And the grievance may not even make sense, but grievance is a very subjective thing. It feels absolutely real to the person that it has, even if that grievance is based in a misplaced sense of entitlement, you know, because of who they are, and that relates either to the white supremacists or even to incels. They feel that their feeling of grievance is real, but often they don't get a chance to talk about it in a meaningful way. And when we can invite someone to share and express that, we can often get to what lies behind the grievance, what's underneath and driving the grievance. I know the University of Maryland did a study, the studies of terrorism and responses to terrorism, I think in 2015. They said the number one factor and correlated factor in someone joining a violent extremist group is childhood trauma. And so often there's and everybody's trauma is unique, and how everybody responds to trauma, you know, is unique. I certainly wasn't the first kid that grew up with adultery in the house, and I wasn't certainly wasn't the only kid that got beaten at Catholic school. But the millions of people that went through those things didn't become white supremacists like I did. They dealt with it in different ways. But we don't need to get caught up in the expression. We need to get caught up in, you know, where's the leak and how do we fix it, kind of thing. And you know, you know, the thing about that shame piece is that there's also a thing I call collective shame, where how a group is treated either currently or in historically, can have that effect of shame that cascades through generations of individuals. But it's important that we provide that space for people to open up and be vulnerable. And like I said, just because we listen doesn't mean we agree. So Sammy Rangel, our executive director, has an expression: never concede, never condemn. And we never concede our values, when we're listening to them, and we never condemn the speaker with whatever that they're saying. We sort of hold this non-judgmental space, and just we have to listen to the story to get to the sort of the source.
Thank you, Tony.
May I just say,
yep.
Kauser, can I just mention one more thing? We met Tony in Winnipeg here probably 6 years ago or so, Tony. And at the time, I had actually thought, and was not so naive, that white supremacy was really kind of a bygone thing. But the work that you had to bring forward was just as relevant for gang situations and other, people that are stressed and act in maybe an inappropriate way. But unlike climate change, it's hard to be a denier now that there is a white supremacy movement. And so for creating that awareness here, I think, we just like to thank you. And we shouldn't be complacent in Canada. We just comment on, the U.S. experience appears to be broader than one would anticipate. Canada, we feel better maybe about ourselves, but there's still lots of issues here. So any differences in Canada-U.S. experience that you just briefly share?
I would say the culture of violence is different in the United States in general. I mean, they've been a country that have been in perpetual war for 70 years. And in order for a country to be at perpetual war, you have to sell it to your population. And I think that has an effect. And it being a country born in revolution. So there's a different culture of violence. But when it comes down to actually white supremacist groups, there's over 100. Dr. Barbara Perry is identified in Canada. And there's about 1,000 in the United States. When you look at on a per capita basis, it's the same. The attitude, ideologies, and the fear. I mean, let's face it, it's based in fear. Most people haven't met the people that they purport to hate. And, we've seen some incredible stories that, and I'm not suggesting for a second it's the responsibility of people of color to get involved with, trying to help in the recovery of a white supremacist. I'm not, but it's when they choose to do that and offer that gift, it's incredibly powerful. We had a young fellow who was a vet in the U.S. and he, lost colleagues in Afghanistan and Iraq, and he hated Muslims. And, and he was starting to have ideations of doing harm to the local Muslim community. And we said, can you give us 24 hours? And two of our team were on a plane out to go see him. It was really touch and go with duty to report, which is absolutely something that we abide by and have done and continue to do so, at least when I was there. And so they spent the morning with the guy, and they called the Muslim Center and spoke to the imam, and he said, I'm really busy. I can maybe give you 15 minutes in the afternoon. And this guy had never met a Muslim except, as everybody's a combatant, through my lens, and in a very disconnected way when he was serving in the Middle East. So they brought him to the Muslim Center, and by the end of 2 hours, he was crying. They were hugging it out, and as far as I know to this day, they're still very good friends, and he still visits the Muslim Center and has become involved in the community. It was really cathartic, and that's that. I can relate to that experience in that counselor's office. Receiving compassion from someone who we don't feel we deserve it from someone that we've dehumanized, is an incredibly powerful, transformative gift. And I've heard so many different stories like that, similar to that. But don't get me wrong. When the person's seriously thinking of breaking the law, we call the police.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just to be cautious about time, we are just in the final stage. But before I share some of the questions that I received, I just wanted to invite Bonnie and Andrea. If you have further questions, you can go ahead now, Bonnie.
Maybe not a question, I would say this, but just probably in addition to what Tony had mentioned, and Gary as well, is just the fact that, Dr. Barbara Perry, and Tony did mention her, she really is, whether or not she enjoys the title of being called an expert, but really is devoted her life to research in right-wing extremism. And I think it's really important for Canadians to realize, whether it's from, a psychologist perspective, from a law enforcement perspective, to understand and accept the fact that, these risks are real. We do have them in this country. We definitely don't have the population that supports the rate of violence that they do in the United States, but that doesn't mean that it's not here. And I think it's important for all of us to find ways to, accept the risks that are there and to start working together as groups and really educate ourselves from a law enforcement perspective, and then how we're going to make that work in our communities and really understand how the best ways that we can identify them and help these people to, go down the path that Tony went down and become a real advocate for an organization like Life After Hate.
Thank you, Andrea. A beautiful conclusion, I would say. I think I'll just take two questions because of our time. So one is actually a reference, possibly Tony was mentioning it at some point in his dialogue, Reflections on a National Epidemic by James Gilligan. So is that the book that...
yeah, that's...
Thank you. Yes, we have a very learned audience today. The question came from Noelle DePep. She's talking about, she has this question for you. Would you be able to address a little bit?
I think particularly going towards choosing a more inclusive ideology, it's the ideology of white supremacy makes sense only from an ego perspective. It doesn't make sense to the heart. And for the longest part of my life, the ego was driving the bus for me, and the heart was nowhere to be found. And the ego should never be driving the bus. It's all right the heart should drive the bus. And the ego can be in the back seat, chirping away. But, we need an ego. But I think it's often these rehumanizing experiences. And, whenever I sign my books, I always say, heal the self, heal the world. And it's when we change who we are in the world, we change the world, and vice versa. And one of the most difficult things I had to get through was the self-forgiveness and self-compassion, given the amount of horrible things I did and said. And I struggled with that for the longest time. And then I came across a quote by the Dalai Lama. He said, "The more I have compassion, forgiveness for the self, the more I diminish my capacity to do harm in the world." And then I got it. It wasn't about me feeling sorry for myself or, good for you, you forgave yourself. It was a responsibility for me in order to change who I am, in order to not harm the world less. And so I really think it really comes down to these rehumanizing moments. And when the rehumanization happens, the ideology, the foundations upon the ideology crumble. And the way you can tell where a person's who's driving the bus is listen to the way they speak. And you can have someone take any holy scripture, and if they're talking about us versus them, ideologies of separation or faiths of interpretations of scripture of separating us and them and judgmental, and that's the ego, that's the head, that's disconnection. If they're coming from the heart, it's going to be about love, compassion, peace. It's about coming together and bringing people together, as opposed to pushing people apart, keeping people out, and separation. So separation is the ideology of the head, the ego. Coming together, love, compassion, those types of things. That's from the heart.
Thank you, Tony. I think I'll just take the last question. It's a question that you partly answered, the culture of violence in the US, but do you think gun policy has something to do, access to guns, with regards to violence?
That's a complicated one. And I think, for example, in the United States, they had an assault weapons ban in '94, and it didn't meaningfully change anything, and they got rid of it. I think in the United States, and I would say the same here, the most, for lack of a better term, spectacular murders happen with assault rifles, but handguns by far. And I don't, it's strange, watching the news in the summer, and 30 people would get shot in Chicago, and 15 dead, and it barely makes the news. And 6 people get shot somewhere, and it's wall-to-wall coverage, but it's every weekend. And I think it's the handguns that by far, but they're often not used in ideological crimes the same way. Oak Creek Temple definitely used a handgun, and Dylan Roof used a handgun in his murders of Mother Emanuel Church. But I think there's an epidemic of gun violence that doesn't get talked about, that needs to be talked about.
Thank you very much, Tony. Ladies and gentlemen, dear audience, we had a very interesting discussion with Tony McAleer, an author for The Cure of Hate. Before we conclude, we again traditionally go back to the speaker just to listen to his concluding remarks, final words, whatever framework you use. So, Tony, what would you like to share with the audience so that we can take something away from today's session in terms of disengagement with violence and extremism?
Sure. I'm extremely hopeful. We may talk about things that make the world seem it's a horrible place. It's not. I'm hopeful and very confident in the resilience of humanity, and we can't wait for legislation. We can't wait for a politician or anybody to fix this. We have to fix it by changing who we are, who we choose to be in every moment of every day. Are we coming from love or compassion? Are we putting fear into the world, or are we putting love into the things that we say and do? And it's up to every individual through millions of tiny acts in every moment of every day to change the society in which we live in, and responsibility. And I'll just finish with quick definition of how I define radical compassion. Number one, your practice of compassion has to take you outside your comfort zone. We're not going to overcome this from within our comfort zone. Number two, your practice of compassion should have a social activist component. It's one thing to alleviate the suffering of another, but we should also seek to change the environment that gives rise or supports the suffering. And number three, and it's, I think, one of the most radical things a human being can do, is to develop self-compassion. And we can't be compassionate with others unless we have mine it from within ourselves. And that journey within is it can be very scary, but it's the most rewarding and the most powerful and most courageous thing that a human being can do. So I would say, go out into the world and be curious, and have compassion and courage. Those three things.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful way to conclude our fourth session today during the City of Winnipeg's Anti-Racism Week. Tony McAleer, thank you so very much from Conflict and Resilience Research Institute and Rotary Club of Winnipeg Peace Builder Committee. And also we thank you, all the panelists today, especially from the Winnipeg Police Service, Bonnie Emerson and Andrea Lefort, who spent almost 1 hour plus time with us, and Caden Lee and Gary Senf. Thank you for your insights and questions. Dear audience, before we conclude, I just wanted to add with Tony's, the whole, the center point of his discussion is empathy and action that makes compassion. So this is what is the main takeaway that I personally get from his message today. And we welcome all of you. We invite all of you to become radical compassionate in this whole journey today. And this is why, and this is how possibly we are going to get a world without hate. And this title I adopted from yesterday's session. We invited Rais Bhuya, who was a survivor of hate crime after 9/11. So once again, thank you so much for being with us. And we hope to see you again in some way or other in the future. Stay well and stay safe. Goodbye. Thank you.